The Norman Lear Center is a research center that studies the difference that media makes. Our premise is that stories matter, that storytellers and storytelling matter. And it's named after Norman Lear, not only because of his generosity, but also because his career in television demonstrated in his own storytelling from All in the Family in the early 70s until right now on Pop TV, the 4th season of One Day at a Time, demonstrates the power of storytelling and the way in which writers can wield their enormous power responsibly. That's why the Lear Center has a partnership with the Writers Guild of America, both the Writers Guild East and the Writers Guild West. And with them, we've been pleased to present this series. Tonight is the 13th, lucky 13, in that series in which we've been looking at topics in the age of COVID-19 and, as it turned out, in the age of Black Lives Matter. And we've been looking at that from different angles. And tonight we'll be looking at it in terms of LA protests, past and present, from the Watts Rebellion to the Black Lives Matter movement today. Hollywood Health and Society is the Norman Lear Center program which hosts this program, and it is a free service to writers. So there are many writers, showrunners in the audience tonight. If you don't know Hollywood Health and Society, we are a free service that will connect you to the best experts anywhere on whatever topic you're working on, if it has something to do with public health, safety, and security. So please take advantage of our service if you don't know it. And if you do, we're thrilled that you do, because accuracy matters and audiences care about what the characters that they identify with believe. This evening, we are delighted to have as our moderator and host my colleague Josh Kun, who has recently been the director of the School of Communication at the Annenberg School, and also is the director of the Lear Center's Popular Music Project. So thrilled to have him, delighted to have our guests, and I pass the baton happily to Josh.
Thank you so much, Marty, and welcome everyone. As everybody knows, we're here today to celebrate and discuss the new book by Mike Davis and Jon Wiener, Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s. And the purpose of our panel is to talk about the contents of that book as such, but also to put those contexts into contemporary conversation with so many of the issues and events that all of us are struggling with and struggling to face at the present moment. And so as part of the panel, I'm thrilled that, of course, Mike and Jon are here with us. Mike is an historian, activist, urban theorist, and one of the greatest analysts of Los Angeles that we have. He's the author of many books, including the legendary City of Quartz, which has taught me and so many others so much about how to think about Los Angeles and do the work about Los Angeles. Jon Wiener is Professor Emeritus of History at UC Irvine, veteran journalist, radio host, and author of several books on US politics and US culture. And joining them, we've got Allissa Richardson, who's Assistant Professor of Journalism at USC Annenberg, and the author of the brand new book as well, Bearing Witness While Black, Smartphones and the New Protest Journalism. And Jody Armour, Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at USC, and author of countless articles and essays, and the book Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Costs of Being Black in America, as well as the forthcoming book on race, language, and unequal justice. And if you follow Jody on Twitter, you also know that he has one of the great views of Los Angeles that there is, a great view, I think, that informs his work and that I think will inform all of what we talk about on this panel. But before we begin that conversation, Marty mentioned that we are, of course, here as part of a project of the Norman Lear Center, and mentioned the long and storied career of Norman Lear. In anticipation of this event, Norman wanted to actually share one story from his own experiences and his own work during the 1960s and 1970s, a particular story about a visit he received in the early 70s from Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers to his offices at CBS here in Los Angeles. And we thought we'd share a little bit of my conversation with Norman with you real quick to start us off. You know, we're going to be doing this event in a few weeks about the 1960s and the kind of social movements and civil rights movements and unrests of the 1960s, particularly in Los Angeles, and how to understand those events in the context of what's happening right now. One of the aspects of that, the important aspects of that, is the role of media and the role of TV, of film, and beyond. And it did remind me of now a classic Norman Lear story that I wanted to go back to and talk with you about, which I believe was in the 70s, which is when you already had Good Times on the air. And I'm guessing we're feeling good about Good Times being on the air, and you got a special visit. And you recount this in your autobiography, but I was wondering if we could talk about it. Maybe you could share that story.
Sure. I'm pretty sure it was Stokely Carmichael who came to visit me. He came to visit the garbage man. That's what my secretary came in and told me.
He called you the garbage man.
Yeah, she came in to see me and she said, there's a black fellow outside who wants to see the garbage man. And she was asking basically, should I be afraid? Should I let her allow him come in? And I said, no, but, you know, it's got to be a joke. And he came in, he said he wanted to see the garbage. He said, I came to see the garbage man. I said, oh, come here. And I took him over to a window and there was a curtain and I pulled the curtain back. I said, you see down there those garbage cans? He said, yeah, you'll find the garbage man Sayre sometime. And he looked at me and he said, okay, let's just talk. And we sat down. And basically he was there to say, you know, the only black show in the air, full family, that exists on the air are people where the guy is holding down 2 jobs and possibly taking on a third. We had just done an episode where he had the opportunity to take what amounted to a third job. And he said, you know, there are black people that are doing well in our culture. It'd be nice to see them on television too. And we were already talking about a show which turned out to be the Jeffersons. And that prompted us to move fast or faster. And so the Jeffersons was born. I had the idea for the Jeffersons and brought in an actor on All in the Family who was his brother, because I couldn't cast George Jefferson. And then I, or the woman did casting for us, who was just great, one of us remembered Sherman Hemsley. And I had seen him in a show called Pearly on Broadway. And I knew in an instant, oh my God, that's George Jefferson. So that's how that came about.
And then, as far as I remember, also that show ended up looping back for you years later when you were involved with a panel on hip hop. And Russell Simmons, I believe it was, talked to you about the impact of that show on him.
Yes. We were actually, the sign on the theater on Vine Street read, you know, something like 5 black guys and a white dude. The night that we did this panel, I was the white dude, obviously.
And what, if I remember correctly, didn't he also say that was something like it was the first time he had ever seen a black man write a check?
He said that evening, yes, he remembered the Jeffersons.
Yeah.
And the particular thing he remembered was George Jefferson writing a check. because he had never imagined that, he never seen it, never imagined a black man writing a check.
One of the things that I love about this story is both how it carries out over so many different decades and still has a kind of, resonance. And specifically about the role that media representation can play alongside social movements. And even just hearing you tell the story in this way, it made me focus on the opposite, which is still the fact that that members of the Black Panther Party cared enough about television that they wanted to come in and talk to you and demand that it change. And I think that it's not just from the media producers' end that change comes, but it's from the movement end, that the organizations themselves see and understand the power of TV and media for advancing social change.
But that seems such a natural to me.
Yeah.
There they find themselves in front of millions and millions and millions of people suddenly. And how could it not occur to them? This is the way to, if we have anything to say, this is the way to say it.
Yeah. Norman, I'd actually love us to watch a quick clip of the Jeffersons, but not the original. This is actually from a one-off reboot of the pilot that you did last year. With Jimmy Kimmel, and Marla Gibbs from the original cast was a part of it.
Yeah, I loved doing that. It was Jimmy's idea, and it was fabulous.
Wonderful.
Brent Miller worked on it.
Let's take a look.
That's just one thing. Do you folks mind if I ask you something?
No, go right ahead.
You got an apartment in this building?
Uh-huh.
And you got one in this building too?
Yes, that's right.
Well, how come we overcame and nobody told me?
Well, I'm thanking Norman from afar, and I'm thrilled to now open up this panel officially and welcome our panelists. So wonderful to see you all. And I wanted to start the conversation actually by, of course, starting with the book that we're here to talk about, Set the Night on Fire. And I'm wondering if we could start, John and Mike, with you, but also then have everybody else comment. This is a book of history, of course, a book about a particular moment in history, about an era, about a decade. And yet it was published at a time when our own days and nights were in their own ways being set on fire and being set on fire anew. And so I would love to have the panel talk about the role that history plays for history itself, but also as a guide and as a window into unfolding contemporary culture, and how much of that was on your minds when you were actually putting that book together. Maybe John, we can
Mike,
start with you.
this is Mike. Well, one of the things that struck us was that while the movements of the 60s, the radical movements of the 60s were all defeated, the children and the grandchildren of those activists are around today. And we see them in the streets now. We saw them in the LA teachers strike last year. The teachers unions changed dramatically in our era. We recount the Chicano moratorium of 1970. At that time, the teachers union was against the kids. They were calling the cops on the kids. What we recall in our epilogue that in the recent teachers strike, the teachers, of course, were out on the picket line with the kids and their families. And we think this is a part of the heritage of the 60s, and that there are probably some direct links between grandchildren and their grandparents who were activists in 1970.
Mike?
Let me say first, I don't love Norman Lear, the story he just told. Sorry. The book was an attempt to do two things that are a little bit novel in writing about the period. The first was to emphasize social forces and rank and file people, not just tell the story of organizational leaders and people who caught the attention of the media at one moment or another. And from that perspective, one of our big discoveries, I think, was the crucial role played by African American and Chicano high school kids, even in some cases, junior high school kids, in the revolts of the second half of the 60s. The second thing is, I hope this would be a strategic history. We're looking back at the crucial turning points in the struggle for equality and justice in Los Angeles and considering what were the alternatives. What was the road taken? What was the road not taken? I suppose you could almost call this military history.
Thank you. Maybe Allissa, we'll go to you next. I know so much of your work is, of course, rooted in the contemporary, but also has a long historical lens. If you could address that maybe a little bit, it'd be great.
I think one of the things that's great about looking at this current moment we're in is that we can tie clear lines to how African Americans always have used journalism to bear witness while Black. And that's the title of the book, because I really trace it back to the days of slavery, to when we think about people like Frederick Douglass, who was a newspaper man, but before that, even before newspaper became, the format of choice, was using slave narratives and pamphlets and autobiographies to really share what was going on from a firsthand perspective, what was going on in slavery and during those times. Because prior to that, in the 1600s, you had all these as told to versions, right? Which really painted it as, this is the best possible thing for them. This is a great relocation, a great experiment. Everything's working out so well. And as you begin to travel through time, when you see these first person accounts become more gruesome in nature, you then begin to question who were those original documents for? And so as I trace through time, these overlapping eras of domestic terror against Black people, from slavery to lynching to now what we have in the form of police brutality, it's always been journalism that has really driven Black people to really rise up and share what is happening. And they've used any kind of medium or technology of the day to get that point across. As we kind of travel through and we follow the thread of Frederick Douglass and see how he mentored and was a friend to Ida B. Wells, we can see very easily how then she picked up that mantle and took that red record of every single person who was lynched that she knew of during that time, to keep a tally of more than 4,000 people. And then as we begin to examine the 60s, which is really the crux of this panel, I then began to look at how civil rights icons are really master producers of television. This is still a really new medium at the time, and news was not in a 24-hour cycle, right? We had 15 minutes of fame, so to speak, with Walter Cronkite or whoever else we were trying to grab the attention of. And so you have people like Diane Nash and John Lewis of SNCC, who staged sit-ins and other really dramatic expressions of demonstration, like marches, to get the attention of the press. And they even sold a lot of their photographs to newspapers. And if I think of the more radical explorations of this in 1968, when everything was a powder keg, and this is when, you have Martin Luther King who's assassinated and Bobby Kennedy who's assassinated. You also had this huge groundswell, a huge shift from this peaceful kind of nonviolent protesting to a more in-your-face Black Panther Party for self-defense, again, because we don't often say that in part of their name, coming out to say, we're going to do a more brash form of protesting. But again, the journalism is still there. The Black Panther newspaper, which was published between 68 and 1971, was the most read newspaper of its time amongst the African-American community, far and above some of the old standards at that time, which would have been like Chicago Defender and those kinds of things. So again, when we think about that long arc of bearing witness through journalism, it only makes sense that African Americans now are over-indexing on social media platforms and smartphones. And we see all these jarring images that are coming from smartphones that are documenting police brutality painstakingly and up close are coming from Black people again. So again, when we think about these huge moments, we need to think of them, I think, not as these riots or uprisings or protests that happen out of nowhere. I think that all of us on this panel really understand that there's a long history of frustration, but also a long history of speaking out about that frustration through any medium necessary.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, a moment ago I mentioned, Jody, in a way tongue-in-cheek, the view. But I mean that seriously, though, about the view that we're all talking about here. And I think in your own work, you constantly are demonstrating the breadth of that view from the past into the present. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about it, and how these issues kind of relate to your own writing and your own work.
The burning issues of the moment. You know, we're talking about a president who on July 4th said that, you know, we as a collective group should be celebrating the statues and monuments, many of them to the Confederacy, right? He is engaging the importance of the stories we tell ourselves, the narratives we tell ourselves. These statues are coming down, these monuments are coming down because they're questioning the standard narrative. And they're questioning it on the basis of these kinds of alternative narratives that people like John and Mike are providing us with, right? You know, people ask, what is the significance of history, right? Trump is showing you the significance of history. He's trying to spin a certain history. Unless you have an answer to that history that's rooted in the facts, like John and Mike do, then you're going to get rolled over, you know, because they're going to win the demagoguery. You know, they've proven to be very adept at the demagoguery, you know, approach and superior, you know, evidently with their brand of ethno-nationalistic demagoguery. So this, you know, I just look at this work and think about the power of narratives, how the meaning of history itself is not something that's just given and, you know, you discover out here in reality, but is a prize in a pitched conflict between social groups trying to define their social identities and vindicate their social existence. And so that's what I love about this work. It's an important part of this process.
So I mean, there's so many things that I really admire and appreciate, John and Mike, about your approach in this book, about the view, the wide view, and the wide net that you cast to really shed light on the complexities of movement history. And one of the things within that I really specifically admire, and this is someone who, as someone who's not a legal historian, was the way that legal challenges and legal triumphs throughout movement history, you put them in context of so many other social movements, other social contexts, from popular culture to housing battles, which we'll talk about in a second. And I wanted to maybe go back to you real quick, Jody, of kind of in your own work and how you understand legal history and legal analysis, the importance of putting the law in that broader context, and kind of what that connection, how that connection changes the way we understand both the past and the present.
Yeah, you can't really understand law without understanding that broader context. I tell my students all the time, if the classroom is going to remain relevant to the real world, you have to bring the real world into the classroom, and you have to take the classroom out into the real world. And I certainly saw a lot of that going on in this book. I mean, I'm going to teach this book in my classroom, but but largely because it has so much of the real world in it, and it has that real world relevance that is, I think, timeless. I mean, you know, you're writing about something that is so germane, you know, the resonances are almost jarring with contemporary times, and yet you're writing from this historical perspective. And it's intentional, it's not accidental. You set out to bring home that connection. And anybody who's skeptical about the relevance of history, I think, really needs to read through this book. And I think its relevance will become abundantly obvious in a way that it might not have been in some more starchy histories that don't get into some of the more well-trod histories. They've taken the well-trod paths, right? Rather than looking at history from the bottom up, grassroots up, you know, the margins in, you know, and struggling over what belongs in the margins and what belongs in the center. they've really given us something of much greater value. And that's what I try to do in the classroom. You can't understand self-defense law without understanding how it will be applied differently if Trayvon Martin is a 17-year-old Brad Pitt and George Zimmerman is a 30-something-year-old Wesley Snipes, than vice versa. You engage in little racial role reversal, and it becomes abundantly obvious you can't understand the law without understanding the real world. And that's what they're bringing to us, the real world in this book.
Josh, can I just insert one thing here? I thought of Jody a lot in the context of the felony charges that were brought by the LA district attorney in the late 60s against Black activists. Evel Younger was his name. And there was a Black student union at the school. It's now called Cal State Northridge. Then it was called Valley State. The Black students occupied the president's office, and the LA district attorney, Evel Younger, charged them with 1,730 felonies, 24 activists in the Black student union. I think it's a record for felony charges coming out of student protests anywhere in the United States. Even today, we have some issues with our district attorney, and I think Jody has been one of the leaders of the movement to get a new kind of district attorney. There's a national movement. Jody's part of that, but you know, it's still going on right now.
Yeah, there's a history in this particular city, as you point out, and it becomes real clear when you read the book, prosecutors who over-prosecute ordinary citizens and under-prosecute cops. That seems to be the constant. And certainly the incumbent today is a part of that pattern.
Maybe, Mike, I'm wondering, could you pick up on that a little and speak about, in doing this kind of historical work, the choices that one has to make about what to include, what not to include, how wide to go, how narrow to go, and when, in terms of the kind of method in doing this kind of history, if you could speak a little bit about that.
First, let me say something about the Black press in the struggles in the 1960s. I think people today have very little recognition of how important the independent Black press was in the United States. And in Los Angeles, there were two fine independent papers, the California Eagle, which had been bought up at the end of the 50s by Loren Miller. Loren Miller is the LA activist lawyer who laid the basis for Brown versus Kansas Board of Education and this landmark victory, I believe in 1948, before the Supreme Court, that overthrew what was then de jure residential segregation in California. He's a quite extraordinary and important figure in history. The other paper was The Sentinel, run by Booker Washington. And you read these papers, and in terms of cultural coverage, music, sports, they were fantastic. Everything was missing in the LA Times. But more importantly, they told an alternative narrative to that of the Hearst papers and the LA Times, which at this point were, both of them, totally behind Mary Yorty and Chief Parker. And an example of that is that on that sweltering August night, when the LAPD turned and attacked a crowd that was watching an ordinary traffic stop, the name on everybody's lips was a 22-year-old woman named Beverly Tate, who earlier had been kidnapped and raped by two LAPD officers, and then later, a few months later, mysteriously killed, probably murdered. Now, if you read the LA Times or the Herald Examiner in this period, you wouldn't have any idea who Beverly Tate was. Everyone in the Black community knew that. And one of the, I think, the tragic outcomes of what's happened to the media has been the decline of the independent Black press. I mean, people, you know, very committed to defending independent Black education, historically Black colleges, but the Black press, like the Chicago Defender, the Amsterdam News, were extraordinarily important in the struggle for Black liberation.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on that. I just want to tell folks who are watching that we're going to have Q&A later. And if you want to start posing questions, you can put them into the Q&A function and we'll take those questions later. But let me pick up on that point about the independent Black press and kind of combine it with larger questions about and related questions about the death of the independent press writ large. And so much of Set the Night on Fire, there's so many incredible moments that we see over and over again, just as you said, Mike, how central the role of independent press and the alternative presses have been towards social movements. And Allissa, I'm wondering in your work, I mean, a lot of, and I might be wrong in the way I'm framing this, Allissa, but I think so much of what I hear you arguing and read you arguing is that while there might be the death of a formal independent Black press, in some ways, there's been a resurgence of independent Black storytelling and Black reporting through social media. Is that a fair framing?
Absolutely. I love that Mike mentioned the California Eagle, because even before it was purchased, we should lift up the name of Charlotta Bass, who was the first Black woman to even be nominated for the position of vice president in this country due to her multi-ethnic organizing and just all of the work that she did in that space to make sure that Black press endured. You can see that spirit in today's icons who don't necessarily have what we call legacy media behind them. So people like Brittany Packnett Cunningham, for example, who I interviewed in the book, are people who emerged as what they call the day ones of the Ferguson uprisings on the front lines, but then quickly pivoted to using a mixture of traditional established media, like the TED Talks that she gave that has over 2 million views, but also keeping her own independent media going in terms of having her own podcast, which has 2 million or so listeners at any given time. And she also has another foot in, the MSNBC world where she's a contributor. And so I really highlight and focus on people like that who represent this new vanguard of what the Black press is. It's really a hybrid between the traditional spaces where we've always been, but then this resurgence of Black voices that are really hijacking, in many cases, social networks that really weren't meant for that purpose at all. And so you see African Americans over-indexing on Twitter, for example. At any given time, up to 28% of the African American community is on there, whereas in the single digits for many other ethnicities and races. So when you begin to look at why that is and why we're using social media as this new space, we must also think that African Americans have always been early adopters of the digital. And so when we think about social networks, before MySpace and Facebook, there was Black Planet. And so the very first social network was a Black space where Black news was being shared. And so as you have these falling off of the print publications and the dying of them in terms of them going only digital or closing their doors forever, you have this parallel movement of all of these Black voices that are rising through AOL Black Voices, HuffPost Black Voices, Black blogs like Angry Black Woman or Very Smart Brothers, which then kind of form today's so-called Black Twitter, which are really a multitude of universes that are reporting on Black news in many different spaces to many different diverse Black audiences, which aren't monolithic. So it's pretty interesting.
Thank you.
Can I add just one thing to that? At least it seems to me that one difference, yes, you have this extraordinary hundreds of Black voices listened to not only by people in the African American community, but since the protests developed, have won much wider audiences. But this is different from community-based newspapers that track on a daily basis events and issues in the community and have assigned investigative journalists. And to me, the real catastrophe in American media has, of course, been the disappearance of all the small papers, and in so many cities, even big papers. If you look at Los Angeles, if you live, for instance, in the city of Bell, or you live out in Pacoima, or you're in Hawaiian Gardens, who's there looking at your city council? Who's there looking at your police? And the answer is nobody. And that's why these.
I don't know. I'm gonna push back. I'm gonna put the Black community, the ones that I've interviewed, the Black witnesses have assigned roles. And I think that's what's so fascinating about their structure, is that they have appointed these kind of quasi-journalists, if you will, these subject matter experts who are entrusted to cover these beats, whether they're always, for instance, camped out at the district attorney's house or near a district attorney's office, or if they're always camped out, for, if you will, at a city council meeting. They're really the same actors each time who are creating these Twitter feeds and creating these updates. And so even though it's not a designated bureau in a hyper-local manner that you're talking about, because a lot of that has incredibly fallen off, I think that's why this vacuum has been filled by these Black activists who feel like they don't see in the trenches anymore that person who is covering that beat that is so close to home to them. Instead, they see a national journalist or a national journalism outfit, really, not just one journalist, but an entire fleet that parachutes in only when the night is on fire, right? And then they leave. And so I think that's where a lot of this activism comes from, is this recognition that you have, Mike, for sure, that says we have lost that community journalist, but we will stand in the gap and do that work because we always have. And so that's kind of the difference, I think. And that's why I call it Black witnessing and give it that ethnocentric lens.
Pardon me, Allissa. I mean, that's great. And but what's happened in this country is, in a way, the inner city long ago migrated out to the older suburbs, the intervening suburbs. And those tend to be the places that are the biggest news deserts. So how do we find out about what's going in Pomona? Because the LA Times doesn't cover Pomona unless aliens land there. What's going on in Fontana or other communities of color in the Inland Empire? Is there some way that this local news could end up being syndicated?
Yes, I think that is the greatest challenge and question. That's what we need to be asking next, because everyone's algorithms are trained differently, right? I get news from Fontana. I get news from Victorville, which is why I knew a Black man had been hanged there, for example, and people were calling it a suicide. I got that 3 weeks before I saw it on the news, televised news, mainstream media, if you will. So there's different algorithms that are at play here, which take a much longer time to reach you if you haven't trained them to kind of take in that news. And I think that's the one problem, is if you aren't looking for it, it's very difficult to find now with just all of these different voices to cut through that din. The second thing is that I think legacy media have to be willing to use the people in those communities as subject matter experts and trust them to report the news and really dig into it the way they would investigate anything else, to make sure, of course, it's not a hoax, but believe them. And I think that's been one of the greatest achievements of smartphone witnessing, is that it has invited many legacy media to come in and say, this is what is happening in my neighborhood, and if you blink, you will miss it. In many cases, the very first people on the scene were citizen journalists. If we think about the Mike Brown killing, the very first person who was on the ground was not Don Lemon, right? It was Emmanuel Freeman. He was a man who was looking out of his window with a cell phone that said, oh my God, they just shot someone. And he has the original photographs of Mike Brown lying in the street with Darren over him, Officer Darren. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to trust, is that there are people who can do this work, but we must look at it like an EMT model almost, as they're the first responders, and the professional journalists can be the surgeons who come in and do the heavier lifting, but they need each other. We can't, in this austerity, this really austere kind of climate, just rely on legacy media to do this work, because they can't be in all places at all times at all.
Thank you.
One of the many, this goes back actually to something Mike just mentioned about migrations from the urban core to the suburbs, forced migrations and migrations of choice. And one of the through lines in Set the Night on Fire, for me, at least when I was reading it, was the centrality of struggles over housing. And I'm wondering if the panel could talk about in both the book itself, but also in your own work, about why housing struggles continue to be, in the current moment as well, so central to understanding structural racism, and so central to combating it and trying to overturn it.
Mike, you should talk about this, because in the first part of the 60s, the two great battlefronts were school integration and housing integration in LA, where there was a lot of direct action, nonviolent protests by hundreds and thousands of people.
Yeah, I mean, in 1960, when the newly formed U.S. Commission on Civil Rights came to Los Angeles, headed by the president of Notre Dame, they were astonished to learn that fully 99% of the suburban homes, the hundreds of thousands of suburban homes that have been built since 1945, were off limits to people of color, to African Americans always, but also sometimes to Latinos, and in some instances to Jews. And there was tremendous overcrowding in the traditional African American community, which was expanding incrementally to the west and south, but far too slowly to meet the housing needs of people in the community. So the group that in the early 60s was a real spark plug of civil rights, the Congress of Racial Equality. I joined the San Diego branch when I was 16 years old in 1963. And it launched a big sustained battle to integrate suburban housing. And we're active in many communities, but the real battlefield became what was then the blue-collar industrial town, company town of Torrance, where there's tremendous home building going on. In fact, in the period 1963, I think more homes were constructed in Torrance than anywhere else. And they did the usual thing of sending a black couple or a mixed couple to try and buy a house, and they were buffed. Then they'd send a white couple, and they would, of course, be welcomed and offered it at a price far less than what any black family would do. So CORE launched this tremendous campaign of demonstrations, which attracted considerable support from the Hollywood community as well. I mean, Marlon Brando forever changed his image by walking in a Torrance picket line. Now, the problem was that although Lauren Miller had succeeded in getting ruled illegal, the restricted covenants and other housing ordinances had done it, there's no teeth to enforce open housing. So Byron Rumford, who's another great 20th century pioneer of civil rights, who was an assemblyman from Oakland, crafted a fair housing bill, which basically applied to suburban homes, units of more than five homes, and it was passed in the legislature to everybody's amazement, because Jess Unruh, the big daddy of California politics for 20 years, was a poor white guy from West Texas, threw his weight behind it. In 1964, 2/3 of the white voters in California voted to repeal the Rumford Fair Housing Act. And that was one of the conditions that made the Watts Rebellion not only inevitable, but I think necessary as well.
I'm curious. I wanted to, oh, sorry, does someone want to chime in?
I was just going to say that.
I'm going to you anyway, Jody.
Well, I just wanted to chime in real quickly on that part of the story, because I think a lot of times we look at the integration of once segregated neighborhoods in LA, like where I live now, View Park, which because I bought it from the original owner, I got to see the original paperwork, and there was a covenant by everyone on Kenway Avenue, my street, not to sell to blacks or Jews, right? So I think that I've had people up in this space who, and I try to regularly, who violate those original intentions, by the way. I hope they're turning in their grave as we flout those understandings and agreements. But I think people think that was an unmitigated good. And I think, what in writing my book and researching, a chapter on just these sets of issues about what gives rise to criminogenic conditions. One of the things that gives rise to criminogenic conditions is a middle class, like the Black middle class, moving from neighborhoods where they were economically integrated with working class Blacks and provided a certain stability to the community. Because of that economic integration, moved to these once white neighborhoods like View Park and Baldwin Hills and Windsor Hills, et cetera, and left those communities behind without the resources that they brought, the social capital and the other kinds of things that brought stability to those communities. And so I've even had neighbors in my own now, View Park neighborhood that's called by LA Times Black Beverly Hills, tell me when some of my sons have had friends over, we don't want Compton up here, or we don't want South Central up here. So, actually it's led to a kind of economically gated community approach by sometimes, the beneficiaries of those covenants falling have turned around and they complain about racial profiling, but they turn around and practice spatial profiling on other Blacks from the wrong neighborhoods, right? And so I just want to throw that bit in there because I think it's sometimes left out of the discussion.
Jody, if I could just add a footnote to that. In 1992, the first elements of the 1st Marine Division were sent into Compton. In Compton, what was going on was not burning down white businesses, not burning down green businesses. It was burning down businesses owned by people like Danny Bakewell and other well-known Black entrepreneurs. Of course, would never think of living in Compton, and in fact acted just as predatory as any white absentee landowner, apartment owners would in a community like that. So there was this clear class division in 92 in a way that didn't exist in 65.
One of the other common threads throughout Set the Night on Fire that I of course knew about, but was really deeply struck by it in reading it over and over again throughout the history in the book, is the incredibly important and central role of students and of schools, high schools, and university campuses in moving change forward, in protesting it. And I would love the panel to talk about how you see in the contemporary moment the role of schools in contemporary struggles. We've got the UC system and USC both represented in different ways on this panel. And we can get into that, but I'd love to hear also about high schools and about what kind of what you all see right now as the role that students are playing in contemporary social movements.
I think one of the things that's most incredible about these movements is that we have high school students who are interacting earlier and earlier with police. I know that from just speaking with the organizers of the Annenberg Youth Academy this year, we have about a half dozen students, well, more than a dozen students who've come to study journalism and to do journalism remotely this year, of course, because of the pandemic, but they're going to be reporting on issues that are important to them. And the organizer of it, Mr. Jaime Carrillas, shared that a lot of these students have police in their schools, have already had unfavorable encounters with police, and they know what this movement is about. They don't feel a need to wait until they get older at all. And so one of the things that we're doing, I'm working with those youth to build a bridge program between our Annenberg Innovation Laboratory, where we have incoming fellows who are activists in their own right, in their own communities, who are going to be paired with these high school students. And the high school students will learn from them and vice versa. And our hope is that during this 9-month partnership, that they will learn, the youth will learn how to organize, how to sustain, how to message, and how to not burn out. My specific contribution is the self-care element, and I will be building program around making sure that these high school students are okay and that they're whole. Because a lot of what we're not talking about right now is that much of this witnessing is being done by youth. perhaps the most important filmmaker of this century is Darnella Frazier, who's 17 years old and filmed George Floyd's killing. She's a high school student. Again, so we think about students and the importance of their gaze and then the care that they will need after the looking. I think that's what's most remarkable, is that these students are literate, they know how to use the devices, but they're still kids and they still need that support there that comes from being a journalist and the weight of bearing that story.
Anyone else on the panel want to chime in on this?
Well,
I mean, I'm sorry, John, you go ahead.
I just wanted to say that one of the things that's changed since the 60s is what Allissa mentioned, cops in the schools. In the 60s, there was not an armed police officer with a gun and mace and handcuffs in every high school, which is what we have in Los Angeles right now. But there's been a very big movement of high school kids for years, long before George Floyd, demanding that the police get out of the schools. And in the last month or two, they have managed to get the support of the teachers union, which wants to defund the school police and use the money for counseling and for conflict resolution programs. So we've seen some progress on that front just in the last few weeks.
In the 1960s, was it 68, John? Yeah, I think so. At Southwest College, which had just opened, it built all these magnificent community colleges everywhere else. But the Black community got Southwest, which was a bunch of Quonset huts and trailers at the time. And there was a really vigorous Black Power movement there, in which the Che Lumumba Club of the Communist Party played a central role. But they were being arrested, kicked out of school. So who came to their rescue? Students from SC, from UCLA? No, it was the kids from Gompers Junior High School, of all places, protested in support of Southwest, and this led to an assault on the campus by the LAPD and a monumental battle that went on for months. Although I'm very old, I still have my two younger children are still in high school. They're Mexican, and they go to an inner city high school. And my daughter's been repeatedly in trouble for contesting the cops when they pick out Black students or Mexican students on campus. But the kids are just amazing these days. They have this totally informal network at San Diego High School that's helped organize some of the biggest BLM protests. So much of the attention has been given to white participation in these protests. But I think what's really stunning, are the Filipino kids, the Guamanian kids, the Mexican kids, and so on, who've been out there shoulder to shoulder. I was asked recently if the expression people of color had become meaningless and this was just a whole Black thing. And I said, not the case at all. I mean, there's tremendous solidarity amongst the communities of color and of immigrants in this country. And it's one of the special qualities, I think, of the current protests.
Well, one of the real clear messages at the heart of the protest that's been impressive to me has been the legacy it represents of Black women who started the Black Lives Matter movement and made sure that they centered Black lives in the movement. And over the last several weeks, it's remarkable how from one coast of the country to the next, in the middle of these protests, the protesters are on point. They're clear. They're not over here talking about environmental degradation, as important as that is as an issue. And they're not over here talking about, a lot of other worthy and very important issues, right? They really are amazingly on message. And that's because of the organizing work, the activism of the Black women primarily, who started the Black Lives Matter movement, built an infrastructure, built a network that lasted from 2013, 14, 15, 16, when the cameras went away. They kept it going anyway. They're out in front of, Jackie Lacey's office for over 2 years, every Wednesday, doing their thing. And so when this moment came back around, like Ralph Ellison says, when it comes to studying history, keep a steel helmet handy because it goes more like a boomerang than like a direct line, right? When history came back around here in 2015, their message was relevant, urgent, spot on, and people could plug right into it, right? They had, all of that kind of already in place, which is, I think, again, what makes it such a powerful and remarkable movement.
And Josh, could I just add one thing about Black Lives Matter anniversaries? It was 4 years ago yesterday that Philando Castile was killed in St. Paul. This means something to me because I'm from St. Paul. Philando Castile and I went to the same high school. And next Monday, July 13th, is the 5th anniversary of Sandra Bland dying in that terrible Texas jail cell. So we remember them today with all the other Black lives that matter.
Thank you, John. So I'm gonna start pulling a couple questions that came in through the Q&A, if that's okay with everybody. And the first one is the following: in writing the history of U.S. people's movements, FBI surveillance occurred, and those records are available. What advice do you have for using and interpreting FBI records?
Well, I wish somebody would give me some advice. I got my FBI file years and years ago, and it was nothing but black marks on it. There's absolutely nothing useful in it. And I know other scholars, people look at Malcolm X's or Martin Luther King's FBI records and made some progress. But what needs to happen if we're going to be blessed with a Democratic administration at the end of the year is we need to go back to the Freedom of Information Act and, take those black marks out and see what really happened. John is the hero of an epic struggle with Yoko Ono to access John Lennon's FBI file. I can tell you how many years it took to do that.
Well, let me just say that the most important source of FBI documents has not been the Freedom of Information Act. It was the raid on the Media Pennsylvania FBI office, a break-in in the middle of the night by some anti-war activists who were never caught. They were the ones who exposed the COINTEL program that showed us the history of how the FBI had fomented fraternal conflict that ended up leading to the murder of 2 Black Panthers on the UCLA campus in Campbell Hall, killed by members of Ron Karenga's US organization. We didn't learn about that because of the Freedom of Information Act. We learned about that because some activist stole the files from an FBI office. J. Edgar Hoover, who was almost dead at that point, closed all the rest of the FBI small offices, so this would never happen again. The FBI had informers, but you have to remember about informers. They make their living by claiming they have tremendously important secrets that the FBI needs to know. You got to keep this in mind when you're reading these informant reports. They can be exaggerated. They can be completely false. They get paid by the inflammatory nature of their protests. So if you're using these archives, check them against other sources and keep in mind the mentality of the employment of the informer.
Thanks, John. Anybody else want to chime in on this? Allissa, Jody?
We talk a lot about law enforcement corruption on the beat. We're seeing it with, in cases like George Floyd, and sometimes that becomes the poster presentation person for law enforcement misconduct. Whole lot of law enforcement misconduct at the federal level with the FBI and at the prosecutorial level. All of those are just as much law enforcement and can have proven themselves to be equally capable of the most, I'll call it depraved corruption.
I agree, and I think even more important than the FBI records at this point may be the more local records which are obscured. In the state of California, even though we've passed this Transparency Act where we're supposed to be able to see police misconduct records, they've been notoriously, difficult to deal with. Many forces just have flat out denied that right to look. Some have shredded or destroyed material. Others have taken a long time to release it, only after an officer is not charged with something or pretty much in the clear from any type of indictment, and then those things roll out. So it really runs the gamut of what method that they're using to obscure. But I think the big push now should be for us to really encourage and lobby at the citizen level for police forces to open those records up. And I know that there's federal legislature on the table right now that asks that there be a big federal database of this, but really it's going to occur at this local level, really pushing the issue that they open those records up.
Next question. It goes back to the question of social media that we were talking about a little bit ago. How would you see ways for us to engage in and foster a non-corporatized social media that isn't dictated by corporate algorithms or individual centrality?
I would love to see that. I think that so much of that happens on a small scale. And when I was researching for the book, a lot of it was on things like WhatsApp. So different kinds of encrypted communications were preferred by the activists because they could kind of communicate there without any prying eyes, so to speak. But again, it doesn't help the general public who may want to come in and help or add some context or be subject matter experts in a neighborhood. So I think that will be the next frontier. What kind of social network can we build that is dedicated toward this kind of journalism that will be sustainable? Because if Twitter goes away tomorrow, I'm sure that that vacuum will be filled by something else. But what will we do with all of that intellectual property? When I was interviewing a number of these activists, for example, I had a number of research assistants who were helping book the interviews, and some activists died before we could get to them, and their live streams died with them because either the platform just completely went kaput, or their family decided they didn't want that content to live on, or any number of issues that included that data then being tied up in their life and it being pretty much erased. And so I worry about the newsreel for the next generation, because in the way that we have these beautiful images of the March on Washington and all these other iconic gatherings in the civil rights movement, we need to be able to protect the newsreels that we're seeing from citizen journalists right now, because they're not protected. They're in somebody's phone, and that is very vulnerable to either confiscation by police or just loss. There's a number of things. So that is the next frontier, will be what is an ethical archive that we can make shareable that won't make the collector or aggregator the subject of police probing eyes and surveillance, but will serve a historical purpose for the purpose of posterity and memory. So that's a great question.
One of the things I heard you asking also, Josh, is can we have a commerce-free utility like Twitter, that we didn't have to worry about the distorting influences of money and even power. And that I'm more worried about. You know, maybe we can, but we seem to keep drifting to models that people can monetize. And I don't know that that's always bad. I mean, it did make, I can see the bad side. We can talk about that a lot. But, you know, I also know that I was front row because my students dragged me into the 21st century and put me on Twitter. And so I was on Twitter right before the verdict in favor of George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin trial, and saw the birth of, you know, hashtag Black Lives Matter there, and then saw after Mike Brown how it took off, you know, and how that was a powerful tool of the most important social movement of the last 50 years. So I have to give that credit, you know, going in and say, you know, like, whoa, right, you know, in its own right. And that was commingled with commerce. You know, we had all the evils of commerce there, but somehow we still made it an effective tool.
Jody,
you know.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Jody, but don't you think we need something more radical? Like bringing back some ideas that were very current and popular at the turn of the century, like socialize the essential infrastructure of this country, including the media platforms, Amazon.com, which is becoming the biggest monopoly in the history, I think, of the world, and it's been the leading piratical winner of the catastrophe afflicting so many Americans. We need to go beyond, private public matters and reforms that can always be, big companies can always, or rich people can always get around. And we need to talk about public ownership and decentralized ownership, not just an agency in Washington, D.C., but something that's truly public. And yeah, let's be more radical.
Mike, that's music to my ears. I mean, if you're talking, now we're talking, yes. Hell yes. If we can, it's been so hard to get that conversation that you're talking about into the mainstream, even in the classrooms, or let alone in the journalism, because, there's almost this enculturated instinct now when you go through a lot of educational institutions that free market capitalism works. It works better than a lot of alternatives. So, take the good with the bad. And it really doesn't work. It causes a lot more harm than good. And I think at moments like this, we're seeing that. This is a moment where, when several months ago, when they were actually standing up on the stage, the Democratic candidates, and arguing, most of them, that no, we really should keep healthcare tied to employment. 44 million unemployed people in that. It seems like, what were we thinking? And you can say the same thing with a universal basic income, and a lot of things that challenge us to redistribute power and wealth in a fundamental way, and democratize the economy in a deep way. Yes, I'm with you. Yes.
Thank you.
And unfortunately, we're on Zoom and Facebook together for this conversation. We have a double dose of being trapped by this. The next question that came in over the chat is, how would you compare the role of women in setting the night on fire then and now?
I love that question. I wrote a paper about that recently, about how this social media and smartphone witnessing has really allowed women to center themselves, and in ways that respectability as a core policy of the former ways that Black people used to protest are falling away. This new kind of embodied discourse kind of pops out. And what that basically means is respectability kept a lot of Black women from being in the forefront before, because a lot of the structures of the Black church, which were organizing structures and meeting places for Black activists, said there should be a charismatic Black male up front. And so that's why you have, all the Baptist reverends at the time, Abernathy and King, who were at the forefront, literally in the forefront of the line when marching, because those were the ones who were pushed forward as the speakers of the church. And the women were expected to do other more supportive roles, like making flyers and organizing things like the Montgomery bus boycott, but behind the scenes always. And so you really don't have many women who are remembered from that era. It kind of was a double-edged sword in that it was trying to, in its very earnest efforts, to show that Black women were worthy of respect and protection in the same way that white women were. But then it also kind of shielded them and pushed down other alternative voices who were not deemed respectable. One of the very most prominent cases of this is Claudette Colvin, who was really the first person to sit in the front of a bus, right? But she was discovered to be a teen mom. And so the Baptist church immediately said, oh, no, it can't be her. It must be Rosa Parks because she's more respectable. She's married, a seamstress. We're going to go with Rosa. And she tells Philip Hoos in this, incredible autobiography that she was really disappointed by that treatment, and that she should have been Rosa, but she wasn't. And so we hear that all throughout history. We see things like Marsha P. Johnson, who is trans, who was sidelined forever in terms of being respected and a movement leader of the Stonewall uprisings. She's an architect of Pride Month, an architect of the Black Pride movement, but was mentioned in a New York Times overlooked obituary section just in recent years. And she died and was killed mysteriously in the 70s, right? So I think when we think about Black women, they've always been this organizing force in the movement, but have always had to overcome kind of Black male chauvinism or these respectability rules that kept them in place that said, you can't be too loud, you can't be too visible, you can't wear braids, you can't have a nose ring, you can't be a single mom, you can't be gay, you can't, there's all these different things that you do not see at all in the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's why I think initially it rattled people so much, because who is this Marissa Johnson to interrupt a Bernie Sanders with purple braids and a nose ring? Who is she to do that, right? But she said to me, this time I was going to be the Johnson doing the interrupting, because Lyndon Baines Johnson interrupted Fannie Lou Hamer back in the 60s when she was trying to testify and say, this is the police brutality I experienced. He preempted her talk at the DNC, and she said, I wanted to be the Johnson this time, doing the interrupting. That's unheard of, and that's really due to the social media and smartphone tools that they have at their disposal. So to answer that question, women are far more visible now because of those tools, and they'll not be silenced.
You know, the most famous Black radical of the late 60s, white or Black, was Angela Davis. But Angela didn't set out to become a famous movement leader. She was named, she was an assistant professor of philosophy at UCLA who happened to be a member of the Communist Party, along with Mike Davis, the Communist Party of Southern California. But she was named by FBI undercover agent, forced to take a public role, which she was talented and experienced enough to be able to do something with. And then she became even more famous when she was indicted with Underground and charged with accessory to murder and put on trial, and became the most famous Black radical trial of the 20th century, found innocent by a jury of her peers. But again, she didn't choose to become a famous prisoner and a trial subject. This was thrust on her. She turned out, as I say, she turned out to be a talented and articulate and smart leader, but that wasn't her original plan at all.
Maybe we have time for one last question. This one I think is addressed, Mike, to you directly. And it's, how did movements sustain themselves in Los Angeles in the past? The current movement seems to have fizzled a bit, while New York and other cities still are consistently out in huge numbers in the streets for 30 plus days now. What is it about Los Angeles and the struggle to keep the momentum going here?
Well, we should remember that, I mean, and this is one of the main arguments in the book, that the real social base of most of these protests were working class kids in the street, in the high schools, in community college. And these are people who every day have to deal with the question of how to eat, how to take care of their mom and their little brothers or sisters. And these existential questions haven't been addressed very successfully by many organizations, certainly not on the white left today as well as yesterday. But the Black Panther Party made a lot of headway on this in giving people the support they needed, financial, emotional, giving them valuable roles. I mean, it was astonishing. I can speak from experience of a bystander and friend to some of the Panthers in this period. Because of their composition, they had to address these questions. The problem for any organization or sustained organized protest is how to make the leadership or the membership look more like its own social base. And to me, one of the great heroes of Los Angeles in the last 50 years is a former Black Panther named Michael Zinzak. Now, there are lots of people who will tell you that they were active against apartheid in the 60s, or in the 70s, early 80s. Wasn't true at all. For a long time in this country, that flag was carried alone by the small collective of inner city kids organized by him. Some of them slept in his house. He got his eye knocked out by the Pasadena police, used the money to create a cable TV program to give voice. He was a key person in the bringing about the gang truths in Watts. But to sustain people over time who live in the difficult conditions that most working class and especially poor working class people do, you have to be able to address these other needs as well. And that's something we have to think about today, faced with general immiseration in so many working class communities, with jobs that will never come back, with public budgets that will be slashed down to the bare minimum, and too much of that allocated to the cops. How do kids sustain themselves and become radicals? It's easy when you're a trust fund baby or a graduate of the Ivies to take 3, 4, 5 years off and be a radical. But when your mom's out there scrubbing floors, or your dad just lost his job and you have to become the bread earner of the family, what are you going to do? So I think this is a primary challenge to the movements of today, is how to provide not only vehicles for struggle on a sustained basis, but in a sense build little arcs so that people can live the lives they want to live.
You just used the word arc, and it made me think about it, kind of implicit in the question that we were just discussing that came from the chat, is that in a way that when we talk about movements, we're maybe in our own minds defining them in a particular kind of way. Because when I read the question, I also started thinking about that I'm not sure I would even agree that movements fizzle out in Los Angeles. If, for example, we talk about movements at the level of culture, of community sustainability. You think about throughout East Los Angeles, in South LA, in Leimert Park, the role, as you write about in the book, of cultural movements that took shape in the 60s, that I would argue continue up through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and up to right now, that make those vital connections through literature, through film, through music, and on, that might not maybe look the same way movements looked at an earlier era, but that the energies and currents and roots are still there and changing shape, but still sustaining, in the way you're talking about, Mike, sustaining folks kind of under the headlines.
Raises the question, Josh, of what are your metrics of efficacy for a movement? I think of Black Lives Matter in 2013, 14, 15 timeframe. I constantly remember people, detractors, carping from the sidelines about, well, how have they concretely moved the needle? Tell me about who have they elected? Who have they done this concrete specific thing with? Who have they done that concrete specific thing with, right? And that's how they were defining moving the needle. What you saw was not only this moment that was made possible by all those other moments, and it speaks for itself, but even back then, I remember going around to college campuses and suddenly we were talking inclusion, diversity, and equity. We hadn't been making those noises before, and that was a direct consequence of the Black Lives Matter movement spilling over onto college campuses. I used to get invited to college campuses to talk about racial justice issues. It was all at the early stages of all of that, and it was always the Black Lives Matter folk with their allies, saying, hey, come over here and talk at, Davis or wherever, UC Santa Barbara, wherever it was, or UC or Cal Dominguez or wherever it was, right? And they were really pushing the campuses in that direction, which eventually then pushed the employers in that direction, because the campus is their happy hunting ground, for law firms, for business schools, come to the business school, et cetera. So the firms start making noises about inclusion, diversity, and equity, right? So look how they move the needle, but not in a way you could point to any particular occupant of a particular office to identify. So yeah, I really hear you, Josh.
I want to lift up some women who did win for office. I think that's such an excellent point, because you have women like Alicia Garza, who may not be on the front line anymore saying Black Lives Matter, but created this Black Futures Lab, which really pushes Black people to use their electoral power to vote people out. And one of the first people to be on the receiving end of that was Bob McCullough, who was a prosecutor who failed to indict Mike Brown's killer. He was ousted, and a Black Lives Matter activist / lawyer was put in his place. Again, the mothers of the movement, Lucy McBath, Trayvon Martin's mom, all of them have run for office. Trayvon Martin's mom's campaign is ongoing right now, so it'll be exciting to see what happens. Lucy McBath won her election. So I think that there's a ton going on in those spaces. Again, if we think about places we don't normally look, and the historically marginalized role of Black women, we'll find that they are in droves heading to elected office to make the changes.
I think one of the ways to answer this question about the sustainability of movements, one of the many ways to answer it, does come back to where we started in this conversation, which is the role of history. And I think the book we've been talking about, Set the Night on Fire, this is an incredible resource. There's so many ways to engage with this book, but I just want to say, I do think it is an incredible resource for everyone right now who, and particularly for young people who are facing the world with fresh eyes, and without perhaps these historical resources, right next to them. This book is an incredible tool. And so Mike and John, I just want to thank you for the book. I want to thank you for the opportunity to engage with it here. Allissa, Jody, thank you so much. We're out of time. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I'm going to invite Marty Kaplan from the Norman Lear Center to rejoin us. See if this works, to offer some last thoughts.
Yes, and to say thank you as well to the panel, to you, Josh, for a terrific job moderating, to my colleagues at the Norman Lear Center, Kate, Melissa, Leica, and Veronica, for doing all the wizardry behind the scenes which make these things possible. Our next event, and I hope you are able to join us, is about ageism in the entertainment industry. And it's next week on the 16th, a Thursday, rather than our usual Tuesday at 4 o'clock Pacific time. Hope you can join us. When you log out of Zoom, there'll be a survey offered to you, and you'll also receive an email. So if you would tell us what you thought about tonight, it'll help us as we plan future events. Thank you also to Norman Lear, and in advance of his 98th birthday 3 weeks from now, to wish him a happy one. And thanks again for joining us, and see you next time. Bye-bye.